So please do not record this yourself. We are recording it today and I'm going to share it with AIA and they will be posting it there, but we want to be respectful of Dr. Kantner intellectual property and we don't want to be sharing this beyond the AIA's confined. And again, just so you know, you will be recorded if you ask a question or your little chat comes up. I'm going to ask that everyone hold their questions till the end of the talk. There's two options. You can either type it into the Q&A below, or you can, I believe you have the raised hand feature, and I'm happy to call on you and let your mic on and you can ask the question yourself. Okay, let me get the other. So I just want to welcome everyone. This lecture is made possible by the National Lecture Program that is offered by the Archaeological Institute of America. And this is just a little bit overview of what the Institute is. Many of you who've joined us today are already members of it. And for maybe the students who are new to Dickinson and new to these talks, this will be hopefully informational for you. So it's North America's largest and oldest archaeological organization with over 200,000 members worldwide. They support all kinds of stuff archaeological. They give research grants for archaeologists working in the field. They support publication. They have several publications that I'll talk about here in a minute, both for the public and kind of academic publications. They host meetings, public outreach, all kinds of great things to help support our understanding and conservation of the archaeological record. Many of you may be familiar with their magazine, Archaeology Magazine. It's widely read and always highlights some of the most recent things of archaeologists around the world. And then their academic journal is the American Journal of Archaeology, primarily focuses on Mediterranean archaeology, and probably many of the students here have encountered that as well. There are many ways, of course, obviously with COVID, things are a little restricted at the moment, but normally under normal circumstances, they host lectures, opportunities to work on archaeological digs, many kinds of outreach opportunities for people to experience archaeology, of course, when we're not in a global pandemic, but hopefully that'll return to normal soon here. And you can become a member of the AIA. They have both, they do have student memberships, which we encourage our students to become members of. So our particular society, the South Pennsylvania Society, is comprised of community members, faculty, students. There's lots of different benefits. You get those publications, you get access to lectures like this, amongst other fun things. And of course, if you're in that position, maybe students aren't quite yet, but once you get out there in the world and you want to continue to support archaeology, they welcome gifts that make things like the projects available. They also do give scholarships to students to attend field schools and wonderful things like that. So there's lots of ways to support the AIA through membership or donations. Okay, well, I'm very pleased. We've gotten a few more people come in since I started that introduction, so this is great. Normally, we would be hosting this lecture on campus at Dickinson College, but of course, due to the pandemic, we are lucky enough to actually still be able to do it via Zoom. And I'm very pleased to be able to welcome Dr. John Kantner from the University of North Florida, where he is the Associate Vice President for Research and Dean of the Graduate School, as well as Professor of Anthropology. I was chatting with him earlier, but I just thought I'd make a note that he is a graduate of a liberal arts college, the Colorado College, where he then went on to the University of Santa Barbara and earned his master's and PhD in anthropology from that prestigious school. He's conducted research in many places throughout the Americas, and what he's going to focus on tonight, obviously, is his work in the Southwest. Generally, he examines the development of social and political complexity in the Americas, and in particular, he does this with evolutionary decision-making and agent-based theories. The other sort of impressive thing about his resume and his body of work is that he kind of employs a wide range of methods. And so those are the students in this lecture from our archaeological methods classes, we're starting to get into this. He does things sort of from aerial view, using GIS and maps and newer mapping technologies, all the way down to sort of microscopic analyses of different kinds of lithics and stones to understand past human activities. And he's published in a wide range of journals, and we're just really lucky. I got an overwhelming number of requests to attend this lecture, so there are many people out there who are very excited to hear what he has to say. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. John Kantner, and he will be talking about turquoise, trumpets, and Tchamahias. I practiced that before. I got it wrong still. The wealth of Chaco Canyon. So I know you can't hear, but from your computer screen, you can maybe clap, and we'll hopefully, he can feel the energy coming from everywhere. So welcome, and I'll let you take over on the screen share.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. And I really appreciate the introduction. Sorry that I can't be there to visit everybody and see everybody in person. Let's see here. Hopefully this is working. There we go. Okay, I think hopefully you all can see that. So thank you again for the kind introduction. Yes, I did graduate from a liberal arts college, and I consider that to have been an incredibly formative part of my education. Glad I did so, and I think because of that, I do have these quite varied interests methodologically and theoretically that I try to apply to my archaeological work. So today, or tonight, I should say, what I would like to talk about is this topic of the wealth of Chaco Canyon. And the way I want to do this is in 3 parts. So the first part will be to introduce Chaco, the canyon itself, and then also the Chaco world, as we call it, around it. And with a particular emphasis on wealth, because I know not everybody who's attending this lecture will be experts in Chaco Canyon or Southwest archaeology. So I will start with that. Then I'm going to briefly discuss some notions of wealth and value, looking at what those terms mean and what that might mean from an anthropological perspective. And then, of course, try to think about what that tells us about Chaco Canyon and about Chaco's rise, and ultimately about what happened to Chaco, its demise. So this is the area that we're going to be exploring, and there's going to be 4 different scales that I'll be discussing. Of course, the first one is in Chaco Canyon. Chaco Canyon itself has a somewhat intermittent stream which drains this very broad basin, which is called the San Juan Basin, structural basin, which itself is part of the Colorado Plateau, which is actually a higher elevation. So it's a dip on top of a plateau, and Chaco Canyon itself drains that dip. These are the areas that, of course, when most people think about Chaco, they know a lot about the canyon. They may know a little bit more about the San Juan Basin, perhaps something about the Colorado Plateau and the manifestations of Chaco there. But there's even a 4th scale, and that is the scale of the entire map here, because it's pretty clear that Chaco's range of influence, at least its range of relationships, covered this map and probably well beyond it. So we'll be talking about all these different levels, but of course focusing on the canyon in particular. So when we think about this area, this region of North America, of course, we often think about an image like this, and in fact, this is fairly descriptive of the entire area. It's pretty dry. It's a high elevation desert, so it's a semi-arid desert, so it's not entirely desiccated. But it is a dry area. And importantly, the region has quite a bit of variability. So this idea about spatial variability across this part of the Southwest is pretty important for the developments of this region, because this particular image I'm showing you is a relatively verdant part of the San Juan Basin, but does show you the diversity of environments, of elevations, of soils, availability of water. It quite varies across this entire region, so spatial variability is quite important. There's also a lot of evidence for temporal variability. So This particular image is showing tree ring reconstructions. I think many of you will be familiar with dendroclimatology, which is trying to predict past climates, particularly rainfall and sometimes temperature from tree rings. And this is a reconstruction from an area in New Mexico. Importantly, the actual variability is not illustrated on this image. Instead, what you're seeing here at the top is a smoothing of the actual variability using a 25-year spline, which basically tries to average across a 25-year moving window. If I actually showed you the actual real variability, it would be such a noisy mess, you wouldn't be able to make sense of it. But certainly the 25-year spline and the 100-year spline gives you an idea about how incredibly variable the climate is from year to year, but also that there are some important trends if you take a look at that 100-year spline. So we have a lot of spatial variability, we got a lot of temporal variability as part of the characteristics of this region. But of course, we also have to understand the historical context for Chaco Canyon. So what about the historical setting? So if we go back, I'm not going to, of course, recount the entire archaeological sequence of this part of the world, but just to summarize it briefly, it's not dissimilar from what you would see anywhere else in the Americas, and that is that early peoples in this region, particularly considering the spatial variability and the temporal variability, tended to employ a fairly mobile lifestyle in which they moved between parts of the landscape where they knew at particular times of the year, they would be able to see in particular foods that would be available in those areas. So they might know that during this particular season, they can go over to this area and there would be pine nuts, but then maybe they need to go over to this other part of the area in order to intersect herds of elk, for example, or deer. So this kind of mobility and this very intentional focus upon diversification of their diet led to the introduction of cultigens coming mostly from Mesoamerica, perhaps some also indigenous cultigens, perhaps around 3,000 or 4,000 years ago. Those dates keep on getting pushed a little bit back each time, but certainly somewhere around that time range. However, it wasn't a huge momentous event when these cultigens such as maize came into the region, and some scholars have really referred to it as something of a non-event. In other words, for peoples who were already focused upon diversification of their resources to make sure that they could survive in this environment, adding in cultigens was adding in just yet another thing that they could possibly put into their environment to eat when they needed to. However, this non-event changed as time went on because people began to focus a bit more on maize in particular, but the other cultigens as the years went by. And this is probably because of two major reasons. One is that the cultigens tended to be controllable, so you can choose where to plant it, when to plant it, how much to plant it. You can put some effort into maintaining the crops. You can choose when to harvest them and so forth. So they're much more controllable than the wild resources. And then also importantly, they can be stored. A lot of these cultigens that were a real focus, such as maize, can be dried and stored so that you can have some food stored away for when there's hard times. For example, maybe the pine nut crop fails that year because of drought, but fortunately you actually have some stored corn to help to cover that deficit. So as you do this, you begin to stay in one place longer and longer, and you can see a big storage pit off there to the left. And as you stay there longer and longer, you begin to invest a bit more into the infrastructure of the places where you're living, such as this basket maker pit structure, which you can see here, which would have been at least seasonally used, perhaps reused from season to season. Now, things change, however, probably in the 600s, and that's because, as you can see here, the climate begins to gradually take a turn for the worst. And so the idea here is that because people already were experimenting with these cultigens, they already knew that they were storable and controllable. As the wild resources became less dependable, they increasingly focused on these controllable resources, the cultigens, and began to be more fully dedicated to farming, and then to overproducing those crops and then storing those surpluses. But of course, this necessarily leads to you having to have a more permanent place to stay. bigger storage areas, more investment in the architecture so that you can be sure to establish your place on that landscape and the fields that surrounded it. So we see above ground architecture, certainly by the 700s, the pit structures from earlier times likely are transitioning into more ceremonial spaces that every single household would have had available to it. And we might imagine that a village during this time period would have been dedicated to farming as well as collecting some wild resources. But there would have been these extended family households, perhaps dozens of them within any particular community or village, and then hundreds of these villages across the area of the Southwest, which I showed you before, all dedicated to farming. So that's the historical setting. And that brings us up to the story which I'm focusing on tonight, and that is Chaco Canyon. So in the middle of the San Juan Basin, where I showed you before, this is us approaching Chaco Canyon. You can sort of see the slightly greener area in the mid-horizon there, which is the canyon itself. And in this area, where there was plenty of these farming villages, just like I just described, in the mid-800s, something new begins to emerge here. So to give you some context, that's about 50 generations ago. And that new thing happens in Chaco Canyon. Here we are from an aerial view of it. This is probably winter. You can see there's some snow on the ground there. It's not a huge, deep canyon like people often think about when you think about Southwestern desert canyons. It's broad and shallow, but it was great for farming. So there were people here, and in the mid-800s, they begin to build something new in the villages where they had been farming for perhaps a number of generations. So Pueblo Bonito is the most iconic of it. You can hopefully make out the footprint of this enormous building there, but there are many others around which at first glance may not be visible, but if I point them out, you might see them. Pueblo del Arroyo, Casa Rinconada, which I'll mention again in a moment. You can sort of see against the canyon wall there, Kettle. There's a number of these, and they're quite different from the normal households where people were living. I'm going to show you a reconstruction of what Kettle would have looked like, of course, after it was fully constructed. These didn't get constructed all at once. But what's characteristic about these so-called great houses is that they're multiple stories high. The masonry is quite substantial, arguably much more substantial than is needed. You can see that the kivas, or the subterranean structures, now are built into the building, but hidden within the building. So you can't really see them in there, but these ceremonial chambers are within this structure. And then fronting it is this quite large plaza area with even some much larger kivas in it, which I'll show you an example of in a moment. What we call these great kivas, as opposed to the small kivas, and great houses as opposed to the small houses. What's, I think, important about this, as far as the takeaway message at the moment, is that these buildings required an enormous amount of labor and resources, but especially labor in order to construct them. And many scholars have seen them as really quite over-engineered for their purposes. Some of these buildings have many empty rooms. As a matter of fact, there's one of these great houses which seems to have been built and never used at all. So I mentioned this all starting up in maybe the mid-800s. By the 900s, this is what you see. There's 3 of them, Pueblo Bonito, which I just showed you, and then a couple more within the canyon. These are all popping up in villages that existed earlier, these small farming villages I described before. But then over the next couple hundred years, sort of in fits and starts, this all gets expanded. And now you can see that by 1100, in what sometimes is referred to as downtown Chaco, we have a packing of the landscape with these great houses, with this immense architectural manifestation. We also see many other things. I'm just going to highlight a couple of them. So I mentioned these great kivas, which can appear in the plazas in front of the great houses. But we also have some enormous great kivas which are off by themselves, such as Casa Rinconada. This gives you an idea of what Casa Rinconada might have looked like when it was intact. Importantly, many of these structures were built to pay close attention to the cardinal directions being aligned just perfectly so, and then also seem to have features to observe astronomical events, which you'll see in a moment, a window light up, which is thought to be a device for capturing the sun during the summer solstice. Inside these buildings, this Casa Rencanada, for example, these would have been enormous ceremonial chambers. There's some debates about what each of these features was used for, but suffice it to say that they're ceremonial chambers, and you can imagine perhaps a couple hundred people in this building observing whatever was taking place there. Archaeoastronomy is a huge feature for Chaco Canyon, so I'll just dwell on that a little bit longer. Many of you may have heard about Fajada Butte and the Sun Dagger. That's Fajada Butte there in the light off on the horizon. If we were to fly over Fajada Butte, you might be able to, if you had a really good lens, pick out these three stones, these three vertical stones that are arrayed against the cliff. You zoom into that. And these three big slabs are situated perpendicular to the wall on which is pecked these petroglyphs. And the stones are just so, and the petroglyphs are just perfectly right so that the sun will form a dagger through or alongside these spirals during particular events. What you're seeing here is the summer solstice. But there's evidence that there was a number of different solar events that could be celebrated with the sun dagger, as it's called, and even some suggestions that perhaps there was the ability to observe very rare lunar events as well. And of course, you can imagine trying to get this set of stones and petroglyph spirals to record all these different events would have been quite a marvelous feat. There's also roadways or causeways. It depends on how you interpret these things, but what you see there in the front is one of the great houses, Penasco Blanco, and you can see that there's a roadway right next to it. And these seem to be articulated with the great houses, carved or even sometimes pecked into the desert landscape and emanating off in various dimensions. And I've spent a lot of time doing research on that, but we're not going to talk about that in this particular presentation. So, but Chaco is more than just the canyon. So while all this stuff is happening within the canyon, we also see similar manifestations occurring across the entire San Juan Basin and even into the Colorado Plateau. So what you're seeing here is some 3D reconstructions that I did of some other great houses found in other distant communities outside of Chaco Canyon itself. And although they're not quite as grand as the ones in Chaco Canyon, they clearly are trying to capture the same architectural canon and identify themselves with the canyon in this way. This one in particular, you can see it even has little bits of roadways. I hope you can see the great house itself, which is south of Chaco Canyon, there in the upper center of the image. And you can just sort of make out the shadows where there's the plaza area, as well as some of the kivas, including a great kiva. And then of course, a little bit of the leftover roadways, which are partially obscured by the modern 2 tracks that are ran across there. So all in all, you might imagine that by the 1000s or so, certainly by the late 1000s, we have Chaco Canyon in the center, but then we actually have hundreds of villages across this whole region, each of which is building its own sort of micro version of what's taking place in Chaco Canyon. Small great houses, smaller great kivas, roadways, even archaeoastronomical observation features. They're even doing roadways. I can see right there. And those yellow lines are the roadways. So beyond this monumental built environment, then, what does all this suggest about Chaco's wealth? What do we know about Chaco's wealth? So I think this is something we could talk about a lot, but I think a good way to get a sense of this is to go back to one of the very first exploring expeditions that took place in Chaco Canyon, one of the first excavations. This was the 1896 Hyde exploring expedition. It was led by Colorado rancher Richard Wetherill, who's well known in the Southwest for having explored many of the archaeological sites during this time period. And it was led, the project itself was directed by a young novice archaeologist, 21-year-old guy, George Pepper, who was coming from the American Museum of Natural History. And you can see that unfortunately part of their strategy was, as opposed to digging in from the top, they dug in from the sides. You can see all of the holes that they've excavated into the side of Pueblo Bonito. But we're particularly interested in this one, where they dug into one of the oldest parts of the building. This is what it looks like today. And although we don't have video from 1896 to show us what was seen there, we do have a description from George Pepper of his entry into this particular room in that area, which happened to be a chamber in which 2 primary male burials were interred, and then a number of other burials as well, but also a lot of stuff, a lot of things. And he describes it thusly. He says, entrance was gained by the writer, and with the aid of a candle, certain objects were seen. Surrounding the left wrist of one of the individuals were disc-shaped beads, pendants. Most of these would have been of turquoise. Turquoise mosaic cylinders. We have tadpoles, frogs that were carved out of turquoise, and these sort of water iconography is very important here. Cylinders of hematite inlaid with turquoise. Turquoise is going to be a big theme in all this. A shell trumpet with a turquoise mouthpiece. And on and on and on. You can see that the total amount of turquoise that was discovered just from that one room was immense. There's tens of thousands of pieces of turquoise and many of these other objects. In fact, Chaco Canyon, I'm sorry, just Pueblo Bonito itself is sometimes asserted to have had 4 times more turquoise discovered there than all other Southwest contexts combined. And then, of course, it wasn't just turquoise. There was shell, there was jet, shell beads, shale beads. We have a whole variety of pipes that were found in many of these rooms. Ceremonial sticks, the functions of which are not entirely known at the moment. We have evidence of macaws. This particular cape here is actually not from Chaco Canyon itself, but they found many macaws and the remains of the feathers in Chaco Canyon, in Pueblo Bonito. There's copper bells. Macaws and copper bells don't come from this region. They come from much farther to the south. And then they also, in the same lines, found evidence of chocolate. So investigations that were done of vessels such as this show that actually these vessels may have been used for frothing cacao drinks that would have had to have been imported a long ways up from what is now Mesoamerica. So there's clearly a lot of wealth of materials, of things that are found within Chaco Canyon, within these buildings. And so the conventional wisdom always has been that Chaco must have, the canyon itself must have controlled a vast wealth of valuable items, with some scholars even proposing that perhaps Chaco was a major trading center that could have extended way down into Mesoamerica. And even that turquoise itself may have been used as a form of currency in a regional exchange economy. And this is an image from an old National Geographic, which sort of captures that notion of major amounts of exchange and bartering and other kinds of economic transactions taking place in Chaco Canyon. So, but of course, this all begs the question of what wealth is. So if we see all this and we think, oh my heavens, this canyon must have been incredibly wealthy, and those burials must have been, particularly wealthy individuals. But again, it begs the question of what is meant by wealth. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about that, going off on a little bit of a tangent here, but hopefully we'll bring it all back towards the end here. So what do we know about wealth? So some of you may recognize this gentleman. So this is Adam Smith, often referred to as the father of classical economics. In 1776, he wrote an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations, and it's sometimes referred to as the wealth of nations. And in here, he explored this question of what is wealth quite a bit. Pull out a few quotes here. So he says, wealth is the annual produce of the land and labor of society, and went on to describe this as being a combination of materials and labor, land and technology in such a way as to capture a profit. And so wealth would be the results of the profits that were captured from these activities. So of course, all this begs the question of what is value, because wealth sort of infers that there would be a value, because things have to be assigned a value to be able to determine whether you have wealth or not. And so Adam Smith went on to describe this in more detail. So this quote here says, the word value has 2 different meanings, and sometimes it expresses the utility of a particular object, and sometimes the power of purchasing of the goods, which the possession of that object conveys. He notes that these two ways to define value actually are quite distinct, mean quite different things, and he observes that the things which have the greatest of value in use frequently have little or no value in exchange, and similarly, those which have the greatest value in exchange have frequently little or no value in use. And he goes on to sort of expound upon that a little bit further, give some examples. So he says, nothing is more useful than water. This is certainly true in the Southwest. But it will purchase scarce anything. A diamond, on the contrary, has scarce any value in use. Of course, it wouldn't back in the 1700s before industrial diamonds, but at the time had scarce any value in use. But a very, very great quantity of other goods may be frequently be had in exchange for a diamond. So this distills this idea of value into sort of two notions. So the first of these is this value in use. The usefulness of a commodity, sometimes referred to its utility. And so you can think of the utility of a stone point as opposed to a stone spear point, as opposed to perhaps a wooden spear point, with one having perhaps greater utility and thus greater value. And then, of course, he also is referring to value in exchange, so the relative proportion. So this is, maybe you could say that two stone points are equivalent to one pot. So there's a value in exchange there, the relative proportion of one being able to be exchanged for another commodity. Adams also went on to identify this particular important concept. This actually forms the basis for a lot of classical economics, also inspired Marx and others, but this was the labor theory of value. Another way to define value of an item is the amount of labor that it took to create the item. Or be embodied in that commodity. So when we think about Chaco Canyon, and I think many scholars have done this in the past, we often think about value and wealth in these ways. So we take a look at what's being uncovered, the turquoise, for example, and we're looking to see how it fits within this notion of value and wealth. Basically, the idea has been that things have value and valuable things form wealth. And we see that there certainly would have been things in the Chacoan economy that would have lent itself to these concepts. So certainly maize had obviously value in use, value in exchange, and we know that value changed over time as the technologies for producing maize changed. Same with pottery. We know that there's different kinds of pottery, would have different kinds of value, both because of its utility, but also because it could be exchanged. And we can see this is an area where I've done quite a bit of work, and we can see that these commodities are moving around the landscape. They're being exchanged between villages and likely, very much in line with the notions that Adam Smith had proposed. However, there's also tons of things going into Chaco Canyon that don't quite seem to fit within this model that Adam Smith was proposing. So we have things like trees. So these trees that are being imported from a long distance away because Chaco Canyon doesn't have enough trees itself in order to roof all those buildings that were being constructed. Volcanic glass or obsidian was also being brought into the canyon in quite sizable portions. The Chaco Canyon also had its pick of the best pottery. This is a particular pottery that was coming from the west that was tempered with volcanic materials that arguably made it a much superior pot, a superior kind of vessel. We know that tons of turquoise, as I mentioned, is coming into the canyon. We have the cacao, the chocolate coming in from the south, shell, which is coming from both coasts, the Gulf of Mexico as well as the Gulf of California. And then other unusual things which make their way into Chaco Canyon, probably because they're seen as having a particular kind of value. These are the Tchamahias, which were mentioned in the title, just these strange, they look like they're axes, but they're made out of stone that wouldn't have lent itself very readily to be used as axes, but certainly was beautiful in appearance. Importantly, only a few of these things have sort of obvious usefulness. And there's really no evidence that these form the basis of any kind of exchange economy. Or that even in some cases, labor was even part of the equation, because a lot of these were just raw materials that were brought into the canyon. Importantly, little was produced in the canyon and little left the canyon. So these things go into Chaco Canyon and they sort of are consumed in Chaco Canyon. They stay in Chaco Canyon. They end up in all these different caches and interments, like the one that George Pepper described when he dug into Pueblo Bonito. So it sort of defies some of the concepts that we think of from classical economics and what Adam Smith would have proposed as far as value and wealth. But the one thing which I think unifies these items was not because their value and use, exchange, or labor, but in the social relationships that their acquisition represented. So you take a look at these macaws. It's clear the macaws were being imported into the canyon. At that time, macaws could only be found 1,000 kilometers away. Chocolate had to come from 1,500 miles away. So to get these items into the canyon required extensive social relationships because there was plenty of people that were living between here and there. So you can imagine that it would have been not just effort and labor to get these things there. It was actually an effort in managing social relationships that allowed you to extend your reach down into these areas and pull in these exotic materials. Turquoise is similar. So it's often been of interest to me that although there are turquoise sources all over the Southwest, if you were to find any place on this map where you would want to locate yourself to control turquoise, it probably wouldn't be here. Chaco was located in a place that had the least obvious direct access to turquoise, and yet it was the major consumer of turquoise. And again, it seems like the evidence shows that this turquoise is likely coming from many, many different sources, which if that's the case means that Chaco had the ability to control, at least influence social relationships across this vast area in order to ensure that turquoise flowed into the canyon. So Chaco didn't control labor and resources. Its wealth was the control of social relationships. So this all leads to, I think, a distinctively anthropological twist for looking at notions of wealth. We're not talking about the Adam Smith sense of wealth. Instead, we're looking at sort of more of an anthropologically informed sense of wealth. And this is this notion of wealth and people. This actually is a venerable notion. It's been around since the 1970s, and particularly came out of work in Central Africa. And it was used to sort of explain what anthropologists were seeing in these areas. And that was that wealth wasn't really equated with things. Wealth was equated with people. And as this proverb here indicates, if you hear wealth, it means people. And as the anthropologists observed, wealth wasn't really something to have or even to use in the ways that Adam Smith may have imagined. Instead, wealth was a way to demonstrate and to establish social relationships in turn. Now, of course, this doesn't mean that wealth didn't exist in Central Africa, just like any other place. And wealth and people is not unrelated to wealth and things, because we can see that lots of these goods were traveling over Central Africa. But these ethnographic accounts make a clear distinction between wealth, by which is meant people, and things, by which is meant food, trade goods, other kinds of utilitarian commodities. Central Africa is not the only place where we see this. These concepts of wealth and people also apply in places like like Micronesia, outside of Equatorial Guinea. So the idea of the classical big man in Micronesia is that these are people that control a lot of goods, but they're actually very poor themselves, because what they want to do is take these things and convert them into social relationships, which they then can use to establish, to get more things so they can establish more social relationships. So in this conception, things create wealth of people by building valuable social relationships, and the wealth itself is not of any particular use if you can't use it to establish those social relationships. So what does this mean about Chaco then, if we go back to Chaco? Well, I think that this notion of wealth and people very much applies. Chaco emerges, as I'm arguing, not everybody agrees with this, but my argument is that Chaco emerges as a pilgrimage center sometime in the 1000s because of a variety of things that are taking place. Certainly one is that it's a relatively wet time period. There's also some astronomical events like the Crab Nebula supernova, which occurs in 1054, which probably could be used to the advantage of people in Chaco Canyon, and probably is one of the reasons why we see all these archaeoastronomical features as part of the Chacoan story. So my argument is that people are coming to Chaco Canyon to experience its grandeur and to be part of a pilgrimage to a place where incredible things are happening. But the ceremonial grandeur, of course, also is related to things, because people are bringing their things into Chaco Canyon. They're contributing their labor to Chaco Canyon as well to build these buildings. And these buildings are the destination for all this great wealth, and that is put on display in these big conspicuous displays to show the wealth and people that the Chaco leadership had. Their ability to influence these vast regions to bring in things such as chocolate, macaws, shell from the oceans, and so forth. So the whole idea here is it didn't really matter whether things were useful or convertible to other commodities. Instead, they created the valuable social and political relationships that helped to grow Chaco Canyon in return, and became this sort of cyclical thing that fed upon itself. So, however, there's always a but here, and that's although there's certainly some positive things to be said about the idea of investing wealth into social relationships, and the social relationships themselves being the source of wealth. Because it sort of helps to think beyond sort of the crude materialism that arguably Adam Smith was advocating for. However, there are some implications from this, the wealth and people notion. The first thing is that, as we can see in the Chacoan case, the relationship between things and people was not exactly static. Things were increasingly personalized and hoarded as the sequence goes on in Chaco Canyon, and that's what this particular chart here is hoping to illustrate. So this is showing the discovery of turquoise and the forms of turquoise that could be from ritual contexts or ritual forms versus secular contexts and secular forms. And the one thing that we see is as Chaco goes along, there is much more emphasis on the secularization of turquoise. And it becomes more hoarded. It becomes more part of personal adornment. It's not for these huge displays of the canyon in general. It becomes much more part of one's personal possessions. I'm thinking that probably that might be happening in this particular case. My proposal is that the people who are leading Chaco Canyon are trying to figure out a problem which a lot of societies have, and that is inheritance. So if you build wealth in people, it's very difficult to pass that wealth on. And I think that, at least my proposal, my hypothesis is that things are much easier to pass on. And so the increasing secularization of things may have been so they could be controlled and passed on to heirs, whereas those social relationships often did not withstand the death of a leader and being able to pass it on to his or her progeny. There's another piece of this as well, and that is that sometimes wealth and people sometimes also leads to trying to actually physically control people. And this can be a negative aspect of it. And what you're seeing here are sex ratios from skeletal materials that have been uncovered from this part of the Southwest, both in Chaco Canyon and then in nearby regions, the northern San Juan being off to the north and mostly to the west, and the northern Rio Grande being off mostly to the east of Chaco Canyon. And one thing which is notable here is that the sex ratio is quite different in Chaco Canyon with a lot more females than would be expected, whereas the other regions have many fewer females than would be expected. And in fact, if we were to take this and break it out by time period, the difference during Chaco's height was much more prominent, where 60% of the skeletal remains were female and only 40% male. So what does this mean? Well, again, wealth and people can sometimes correlate with forms of servitude, And there's even some evidence that some of these females may have been captured and brought to Chaco Canyon, perhaps from these other regions where the females are underrepresented. So these dark sides of Chaco's story, and arguably the dark sides of focusing on growing wealth and people, may have ultimately contributed to Chaco's demise, because as time goes on, and Chaco is demanding more and more on the social relationships across these vast areas, perhaps even trying to convert wealth and people into wealth and things so they could be able to pass on and hoard all this wealth to solve the inheritance issue. At that time, the economy begins to take, the climate begins to take a turn for the worse, and some severe droughts hit. So this is the height of Chaco, and you can already see from the bottom that this begins to change as the climate begins to drop and pretty substantial droughts begin to hit the region. At that point, everything falls apart. So if Chaco is no longer able to control these social relationships and bring in all these goods as a result of those relationships, then the people stop paying attention to Chaco, and it basically becomes a dusty, empty ceremonial center, pilgrimage center, where there's no more pilgrims coming because the spectacles aren't the same as they used to be. By the mid 1100s, the canyon is largely vacated, largely ignored, and it doesn't quite have the same grandeur ever again, although there's periods of reoccupation afterwards. So what can we take home from this? What's the lesson from all this? Well, I think that there's part of it is the story about sort of the Adam Smith idea about wealth and value, and this more anthropological look at it, and how in history we can see that there's been a swing back and forth between imagining wealth as being social relationships and those relationships and people, as opposed to wealth being actual things that you hoard and keep together. It probably sometimes may seem dehumanizing to talk about wealth and people, but then again, I've pulled this from an investment site. Still today we often talk about how people are such an important part of forming wealth. It's not just the items; it's also the social capital and the human capital that leads to our notions of value and wealth even today. So, with that, I am pleased that you all stuck around. Thank you for listening, learning what I have to say about Chaco Canyon, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Okay, well, since I don't think you can hear everyone else, I'll just do a loud applause for everybody. I'm sure they're all applauding wherever they are. Thank you so much. So I think what I'll do now is we do have already a couple of questions in the Q&A. Let me pull up the participant list. So again, there's a couple of ways you can ask a question. Feel free to type it into the Q&A, but you can also raise your hand and I can unmute you and you can ask it yourself. So I'll just go ahead. The first question that Alan Dart asked was, does the paleoclimate reconstruction graph represent temperatures, precipitation, or some other climate features?
Yeah, it's a good question. So that particular sequence, which I showed, was really focused upon precipitation. So, and it's from a part of New Mexico, which is a little bit farther to the south. It happens to be the area where I showed the little box where I've been working south of Chaco Canyon. And so the focus on that particular sequence is on precipitation. The temperature and the use of tree rings for looking at temperature becomes particularly important as you go farther north in the Southwest, particularly into the sort of San Juan area where the mountains are and where cold would have had a major impact upon the ability of farmers to be successful. Good question.
Thank you. All right, so then the other question on the list, I'm just going to go in order, is what is the relationship between Chaco and Paquimé Casas Grandes?
So, I was trying to think of the most succinct way to answer that question. So for those of you who don't know, Casas Grandes is in what is now northern Mexico. It is a somewhat later set of sites. It's really, Paquimé itself is one huge building, not unlike Chaco Canyon. It it used to be thought that they were contemporaneous. And so the control of the flow of these items, such as turquoise going to the south and macaws and copper bells going to the north, would have been mediated by Casas Grandes as a sort of a middleman. The sequence now shows that it's actually later than Chaco Canyon. And so it's unclear the relationship. One of my mentors, Steve Lexon, who some of you, if you're pay attention to Chaco Canyon, would know about him. He proposed that when Chaco was abandoned, to make a long story short, the people went down and formed Pacame, or Casas Grandes. So, and there is some architectural similarities. Clearly macaws, lots and lots of macaws in Casas Grandes. But whether that's because there's a direct, a direct linkage of actual people moving back and forth, or whether these are ideas that are moving back and forth, I think are still open for debate.
Thanks. Great question. All right, the next one is, how were the great houses lit inside? If just fire and no natural light, how do they keep from breathing as much smoke as air?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So this is another debate which I can get into, but there are those of us, of which I include myself, who think that those buildings were mostly empty, and the people weren't actually living in them. And the questioner, I think, brings up one reason why that would be the case, because if you've been to Chaco Canyon and explored the buildings that are set up for visitors to see, it's amazing there. And you would, if the building was intact, it would be dark, it would be smoky. It would not be a place where you went because it was fun to go hang out there, or probably wouldn't want to sleep there and so forth. So I tend to think that these buildings were built just because it was a way to use those social relationships, which I described, in order to sort of generate more grandeur, more impressive monumental architecture in the canyon. And so they just kept on adding on rooms and rooms and rooms and rooms and rooms. I mentioned that there's this one of the last great houses built, called Wajiji, was constructed. It's huge. And there's not a single artifact that was found in it. It was never used. So I tend to think that these buildings were not really residential. Good question.
Yeah, thank you. Oh, that was just a comment. They enjoyed the virtual tours of Tetroquetal and Casas.
I can't take credit for that, but I'm glad you liked it.
Yeah, there's some. Yeah, there's some that are available. I sometimes use in the class. So, but it brings them to life, because all you see are the bricks now. And so, yeah, thanks. So Sarah asks, did and how record astronomical events, or was it all oral stories?
So we have these, like the sun dagger, we have these features that where clearly they were designed in order to try to commemorate or sometimes predict these astronomical events. But we also know from ethnographic cases in the Southwest that farmers throughout the Southwest have always known when the solstice. I mean, these aren't like huge mysteries that you need to have a sun dagger in every single village in order to figure out when these solar events are. So, you have sun watchers in every village, arguably, who knows on the horizon where the sun is going to come up or set during one of these solar events. So I'm not exactly answering your question here directly, but so it's interesting that these features were actually built into all these buildings, because they're not really necessary. And in fact, the sun dagger itself was never meant to be predictive. It only happens on the days when the solstices and equinoxes occur. So it's more sort of grandeur, more monumentality, more sort of impressive things to show off to people, not just the stuff that Chaco is consuming as a canyon, but also the knowledge that it has in its arsenal to show people. So to answer your question, I think that people always knew about them, as farmers are wont to do. But part of that, of course, was passed on through oral stories. We don't have any written accounts that did not have that form of communication that we know of. Good question. Thank you.
Great. Okay. I'm getting a couple of questions into the chat, but I'll finish off these Q&A ones and then we'll keep going. How do the great houses in Chaco relate to one another with regard to your discussion of wealth? For example, is turquoise found distributed more or less equally in all, and is there a greater concentration in one or two of the houses?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, part of the story here is that a few of these buildings in Chaco Canyon have actually been excavated, certainly not using, modern excavation techniques. So, Pueblo Bonito has been excavated multiple times. There were buildings that were excavated for which, like Tetrachetla, for which we actually have very little of the materials now because they were not well curated or and the notes weren't, well taken. So we don't really know a whole lot about what was found in those buildings. There's also stories of even earlier pot hunting that may have occurred, which found even more marvelous stuff out of buildings, but we just don't know because, of course, that there's no records of those besides rumors. But the question is important because we don't. The answer we don't know, and we would hope we could know. But excavating these buildings is not something which is going to happen anytime in the near future. There have been some suggestions that different buildings were controlled by different factions or by different family groups. And that could be answered if we had enough data from those buildings. But again, our data is dominated by old materials or old excavations that came largely from Pueblo Bonito. So yeah, sorry, I don't know the answer to that. It's a good question, though. It's important for really addressing what I talked about.
Yeah, I'm going to ask a question that's in the chat that's kind of related to that from Joe Wagman. Hi, Joe. So is there a single unified leadership group centered in Chaco, or would they have been dispersed to different villages during the rest of the year?
Another great question. So there's different views on this. So some of you may be familiar if you follow the stories about Chaco Canyon, the archaeology about Chaco Canyon, that there have been some archaeogenetic studies that have been done recently that suggest that there was a strong matrilineal lineage that is reflected in the burials that were recovered from Pueblo Bonito specifically, and even that perhaps there's actually at least two burial clusters in Pueblo Bonito, that there may have actually been sort of a different lineage in the other burial cluster. So we might imagine that this would fit into the notion that each of these great houses was controlled by major family groups. And those major family groups likely had their own social relationships outside of the canyon. And one might even imagine, although now I'm getting into even greater lengths of conjecture than I even went through in my lecture, but one might imagine that there's almost like a Red Queen's race, if you're familiar with that concept, between these different houses. So they're all trying to tap into these social networks outside of the canyon. And so they're having to sort of out-grandeur one another. So it's not like a monolithic socio-political entity in Chaco Canyon. Instead, it's like a bunch of grocery store chains that are competing with one another, trying to attract customers. And that's maybe a little too crude of an analogy, but you sort of get the point. So yeah, that's a good question. Again, we often think of Chaco Canyon as having been excavated over and over again, and we know a lot about it, but there's a heck of a lot we don't know.
And again, I'm going to kind of skip around here because this, I think, is again kind of related to what you've just been answering, but maybe just to clarify, do you have any idea why it was Chaco that became such a center of social wealth, and why not another village or town near a valuable resource?
So another great question. Matter of fact, I should just do these lectures where I just answer questions. There's that's a lot more fun for me. But anyway, so yeah, that's a good question. So so if you look at Chaco, and I don't remember all my red dots of all the villages. It's actually not in the center, so it's sort of odd. To the east and to the northeast, there's really not much Chaco in there. But I've argued that there's something unique about the canyon. And one of the ideas that I hoped would be the case is that it's thought, or at least was once thought, that there was a big lake in the canyon that was formed by a natural dune that covered the outlet for the Chaco River. And if in fact there was a big natural lake there. If you've been to the Southwest, there are not a lot of natural lakes. We have to dam stuff up to have lakes in the Southwest. So that would have been quite unusual and could have been one reason why Chaco emerged as a pilgrimage center, this destination, because it actually had water where it didn't exist anywhere else. I liked that idea, but more recently there's been some challenges to the notion that there was a lake in Chaco Canyon. It's not my area of expertise. I wait for the experts to weigh in on all that, the geologists to weigh in on that, but that would do it if there was something like that there. It also has some unique geology, just going a little bit of a tangent. There are some unusual fossils in Chaco Canyon, particularly of marine shells, marine mollusks, and marine anything is an important symbol in the Southwest. Today was back then, you could see there was carved frogs and tadpoles and there's ducks and all that kind of stuff. So anything related to water is important. And I've often wondered whether Chaco didn't also leverage its access to some of these unusual fossils to help to build its standing in the region. Good question.
That's very interesting. Okay, Nikki Cummings asks, thank you so much for your absolutely outstanding talk. Do you think that Chaco Canyon itself could also function as a sort of middleman or mediator between exchange that reached even farther, or is it really primarily serving as a terminus for most exchange?
Yeah, so it used to be thought, and particularly with the roadways, that Chaco was a major redistributive center. So you can imagine all those buildings are perfect for storing corn in and all these surpluses and goods. And so things would come into the center and then get redistributed out through barter or other forms of exchange to go back out to all the communities outside of Chaco Canyon. But almost all the studies that have been done show that, yes, there's lots of stuff going into the canyon, but nothing ever leaves the canyon. So it sort of begs the question of it's certainly located in a place where you could imagine that happening. And there are roadways that are there, but the evidence shows that there's nothing ever going out. It just goes into the canyon and gets consumed. Now, that doesn't mean, I think, we mentioned being a mediator for exchange. One could imagine that pilgrims that go to Chaco Canyon would establish their own personal relationships. So this doesn't have to be a singular story, even at the same time that people in Chaco Canyon are competing for more attention and to have more of these exotic goods brought in. People may have also been going because then they could establish relationships with neighbors that were maybe a little more distant. And even though exchange may not have happened in the canyon, those social relationships were then taken back to their villages, and they could use those for their own purposes later. So it could have been that that was one of the motivations for pilgrims going there in the first place, was to establish those kinds of relationships. Good question.
Okay, so I'm going back into the chat kind of along those lines. Is there any evidence of roads going to Mesoamerica, such as indications where local roads were?
So no, not so far. The roadway situation is a little complex because there's a lot of sort of geomorphological challenges to the roadways being able to be actually discovered today. So they tend to be found, where there wouldn't have been a lot of erosion and so forth. So we don't really know the full extent of the roadways, but there's not really any serious evidence that they would have extended that far. I think that most of the roadways, as I showed in the map, which had all the little yellow lines, most of those roadways only went a very short distance. They were, I would say, I consider them ceremonial causeways. They were basically just sort of horizontal extensions of the monumentality of each great house, and not much more than that.
Thank you. I guess I'm going to jump in with a little question related to that. So the chocolate is so interesting to me. I'm an archaeobotanist, so I love that. But what are people thinking about how that got there? So again, would it have just been someone's connection with a connection with a connection, or I don't know. I just think that was such a cool realization for many people that I was just curious.
Yeah, so that's a good question. It's a good question. So the evidence for it, for those of you who don't know, is that there's a particular compound that's found within the walls of these vessels that theobromine and other analogous compounds that are could only be found in chocolate, or I shouldn't say only be found, they are found in chocolate. And there is no known plant in the Southwest that produces those compounds itself. So the problem is that as people have started to look at other contexts, seems like these particular compounds may be more widespread than originally thought. It was once thought they were just in those frothing vessels. But there have been, some people have done studies that suggest they could have been in a lot of vessels, in which case it's sort of, that's to answer your question, it becomes, if it's a small scale volume, that's one thing. If it's like found everywhere, that's quite radically different. And I'm still honestly not convinced that there isn't a local source for these xanthines, these compounds. Because while we don't have any evidence of plants in the Southwest that have xanthines like theobromine, it doesn't, almost none of the plants in the Southwest have ever been characterized, so we actually don't really know that. So it's still, in my mind, sort of an open question about the scale of the exchange to the Southwest for cacao.
Great.
But yeah, but there's great work that's being done on that. So hopefully we'll know more soon.
Thank you. Okay, are we good? You're welcome to, I think we have a few more questions. Are you doing okay with that?
Yeah, I can do a couple more, sure.
Great. Okay, so Luke asks, okay, we'll talk about abandonment now here. You mentioned that Chaco was largely abandoned following a period of drought. Is this trend limited to Chaco specifically, or does the same phenomenon occur at contemporary sites in the same region as well?
Yes, that's a good question. So it's interesting that, so again, but the caveat is that very few of these buildings have been excavated. That's true, certainly in Chaco Canyon. It's definitely true for all those other villages outside of Chaco Canyon. But the evidence so far suggests that Chaco sort of fell apart from the inside out. So construction and the use of Chaco Canyon ceases first. And then there's almost like a wave or like a ripple, pebble thrown into a pond where Chaco sort of falls apart, and then other things start to fall apart around it. And some places don't fall apart at all. They continue to move, thrive. They still are doing some Chacoan stuff. Some of them actually adapt the Chaco Canyon and make it a little bit different. So for example, they take the roofs off of great kivas and make them more open to public. So there's definitely some innovation that takes place there. Other places like where I work farther south, they're also abandoned as people move away from those regions to probably not very far away, but it was pretty disruptive when Chaco fell apart. I think a lot of those social relationships also became fragmented, and different regions and different villages probably responded in quite different ways. Good question.
Okay. I did see a hand raised. Robbery Clark, did you want to ask? I'll allow you to talk if you wanted to ask your question.
Yeah, it was just this. It's Robert Clark. That's a typo. Anyway, it's this question about the roadways. You've answered most of my questions, but there was some concern a couple of years ago that under the Trump administration, there was a lot of authorization of drilling and so on in the immediate area of Chaco that might interfere with LIDAR and other attempts to identify roadways. But have you concluded that they were just very brief causeways, short, that not worth pursuing that?
No, so that's to make sure. So yeah, I probably misspoke a little bit. So there are some long roadways that come out from Chaco Canyon itself. So there's the Great North Road, which I think was the biggest concern for oil and gas exploration. And then there's the South Roadway. There may be a couple of other longer roadways that clearly they're clearly documented going across the entire San Juan Basin. Almost all the other roadways, however, just little snippets that are articulated with other great houses. But certainly, the concern has been, it really, it was before the Trump administration. I'm sure it will continue to be a concern. Although, obviously the Trump administration had a different idea about the use of these resources, but it was, the saving grace has been the, I won't say collapse of the oil market. That's a bit of an exaggeration, but the oil market hasn't been booming enough to really warrant these leases being cashed in on and exploration taking place. However, there is a lot still that's out there. There's oil pads everywhere across that part of the San Juan Basin, and already quite a bit of destruction. So the protection they're trying to do is to at least have a buffer around the canyon, so at least some of these manifestations can be preserved. But when you have roadways, these old roadways that are going across dozens and dozens of miles of prime energy resources, it's going to be hard to protect them forever. But yeah, we've tried. We're trying.
Thanks.
All right, there's 3 more questions. How about we do those? Is that okay?
Okay.
2 of them are pretty short. One, what about the Mesa Verde influence? Change from cylindrical cacao vessels versus MV mugs around 10.
Yeah, Mesa Verde mugs. Right. So so there has been ideas on and off over the years that the connection between the Mesa Verde region, which we sometimes call the San Juan region, and Chaco Canyon was pretty robust, including the idea that Chaco actually was founded when people came down from the Mesa Verde region, came down and helped to sort of provide the seed for Chaco Canyon. And then that connection may have continued into the post-Chaco period, with even one of the big buildings up in the Mesa Verde region perhaps being one of the retreat places for the deposed leadership of Chaco Canyon. So there's probably always been pretty robust connection between those 2 regions. But one idea that was once proposed, which was that the canyon was largely taken over by Mesa Verde people, probably has not withstood the test of time. And the mugs were often pointed to for that. It probably was just as Chaco was fading around that time period, some other ideologies and new forms are beginning to replace it, and that mugs may be part of that.
Thank you. How widespread are the macaw artifacts in the Southwest?
It's a good question. So they're not as widespread as you might infer from my presentation or others. Now, whether that's so, there's the biggest source of macaws in the Southwest beyond Pacame or Casas Grandes are 2 sites, one in Arizona near Flagstaff, and then Chaco Canyon itself. And the numbers aren't huge, dozen-ish, 20, off the top of my head, I don't remember the exact numbers in Chaco Canyon. But again, relatively little of the canyon's been excavated. So if we were to excavate the whole thing, well, it'd probably be a lot more. Outside of these areas, they're not very common. Now, having said that, that road that I showed you actually came from southeastern Utah, found in a cave. That's why it's so well preserved. So whether they're not widespread because of preservation issues or just because sampling errors because it hasn't been enough excavated is unknown at this point, I think. I don't think there was ever every household had a macaw or anything like that. They were still pretty selectively curated in some of these buildings.
All right, last one. Thank you so much. All right, Ivy, a student in the Archaeology and World Prehistory. Thanks you for your talk. What was the size population of Chaco? Or do we know how large the influx of people coming into it was during trade? And then following up from that, what sort of evidence do we have regarding the impact of the large amount of people on agriculture or the environment?
Yeah, that's some good questions. So, this is another vigorous debate about the population in Chaco Canyon, as well as its ability to sustain populations using local resources. So there's some who feel like there was very few people in the canyon, and at the same time, the canyon really can support very many people. And I probably would fall on more that side of the camp. But there's others who have made pretty compelling arguments that the canyon actually could be quite productive compared to maybe what you would think today going out there, and that there are many more people around as a result. So the answer is I don't know. That's a long way of saying I don't know the actual answer to that. The key is whether you think those buildings, the great houses, were residential, domestic structures, or whether they were mostly empty. Because if they're mostly empty, then there's relatively little I won't say little evidence, but the population would be much smaller than if those buildings were totally occupied. I think they're mostly empty. I think that there was a resident population there that was able to survive on the resources that the canyon could provide, but no doubt they benefited by other people bringing in more resources to help them out. So that's a good question. So the influx of people, so to continue along with that, I've often, and I'm not the only one to think this, I've often thought that perhaps those buildings were largely empty, except during pilgrimages. And then the pilgrims could stay in the buildings. And so one might infer that there was a lot of people that came in during particular events, whether it's the solstice or whatever the event might be. And there's been some debate about the deposits. So whether we have these big, thick deposits that were all formed at once, which showed that there were a ton of people there at the same time. And then some other scholars who have argued that those same deposits, don't quite show what some of us think. So archaeologists argue among themselves all the time, it seems like, but the debate is ongoing. It's a good question. And we know, not just looking at Chaco Canyon, but throughout the sequence in the Southwest, that people, probably the biggest limitation was firewood, because plants don't grow out there very fast, and the trees don't grow very fast. After a while, you're going farther and farther to get firewood, and then you have to move. It becomes inconvenient to walk miles and miles just to get some firewood. So the impact was probably more along those lines than anything, like rampant environmental destruction. So thank you all for these questions. These are great.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, John. Again, I'll represent the clap for everybody. Thank you. Thanks to everyone who came. And as I mentioned, this has been recorded. So if you want to go back and watch it via the AIA site, you can do that. Thanks again. And maybe someday we'll actually get to have you here in person.
Yeah, that'd be nice. All right. Thank you all for coming. Have a good night.
Good night, everybody.